One in the West knows more about Bashar al-Assad than our speaker tonight, David Lesch, who is professor of Middle East history at Trinity University in San Antonio, and who over years developed a close personal and professional relationship with the Syrian leader. Assad became Syria's ruler in 2000 at the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who was a cunning and ruthless leader, most famous for massacring up to 20,000 of his own people in the town of Hama in 1982 to put down an insurrection by the Muslim Brotherhood. The son Bashar was a British-trained ophthalmologist who became president only because an older brother who was the likely successor to his father had died in a car crash. Bashar appeared unprepared and ill-equipped to become the leader of Syria and of the Alawites, the Shiite Muslim minority that wields power despite representing only 13% of the population. But he gave signs in an enlightened inaugural speech that he might become a reformer and introduce a leadership model more acceptable to the outside world than the strongman example set by his father. He and his glamorous British-Syrian wife, Asma, appeared modern and accessible, setting a new tone at home, mixing with the public. And abroad, Western policymakers talked openly about achieving an eventual settlement of the Israeli-Arab dispute by following a negotiating path that went through Damascus. In recent years, I heard them talk up Syria that way right here in this room during off-the-record IPI meetings of leading Middle East negotiators. We have watched from afar how starkly and horrifically different the result turned out. David Lesch has watched from close up, traveling to Syria more than 20 times since his first trip there in 1989 on visits that sometimes lasted months. During that time, he became friends with many Syrians and most importantly with Bashar al-Assad himself. In 2005, he wrote a book entitled The New Lion of Damascus, Bashar al-Assad and Modern Syria. And publication of that book led to more trips to Syria and conversations with Bashar. That book posited the possibilities for Syria that Bashar embodied. David Lesch's experience with Bashar in Syria since then has placed the author in a very different place than he was then, a passage that he describes compellingly in his new book. That book, by the way, is for sale at the door, and David will be here after we finish the program to sign copies. David's account of how he got here from there and where we might be going is a fascinating one, based, as it is, on both his deep knowledge of the Middle East and his personal exposure to the country and to the man who rules it, and how that man's view of himself and his role in the world changed so profoundly. I'm delighted that he is here this evening to walk us through that journey and to engage us in conversation on the current crisis and whether there is a way out of it and what that way might be. David Lesch, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Okay. Thank you very much, Warren, and thank you to the Institute for having me here, and my wife, Judy. And Warren told me that I could either stand or sit, and I said, well, I'll do what I normally do in class. I stand and walk around a little bit. And the only difference is my classrooms do not have this view behind me. If you were my students, they would never hear anything I ever said because they would just be looking out. Hopefully I can retain your attention a little bit better.
We would put the blinds down.
Okay, please. If you see them, but they're used to it, right? You've been here a lot. I might look out actually a few times. First of all, my wife, Judy, who is here, was raised in New Jersey, East Brunswick. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. My mom was born and raised in Newark, New Jersey, so we still have many ties here. And so I first want to to say that the tri-state area have our sympathies and even empathy for the challenges that this area has faced over the last couple of weeks, and hopefully things will be getting back to normal very quickly. And I guess from one sad story to one of hope and recovery, I will go to another sad story that perhaps has less hope for recovery in the near term, and that is Syria. And it is a very sad story. As Warren recounted, I've been traveling there for many years, and well over 20 times, and made many friends. Some of those friends are dead now. I have friends on both sides of the conflict, many of whom whose lives have been unalterably changed, many of whom have gone into exile. So this is a very, personally, a very difficult story and challenging one for me to examine. And to see this beautiful country destroyed is very disheartening and saddening. And because the Syrian people deserve freedom, prosperity, and stability no less than any other people. They are wonderful people, and it's a wonderful country. I know many people in here have traveled there, and I think you would agree with me in that. And hopefully that day will come very soon. The title of the book, The Fall of the House of Assad, I originally wanted a question mark at the end. Publishers don't like question marks. And so I said, okay, that's fine, and but then I thought about it, and I explained this in the preface a little bit, that when I wrote the book in about 4 months, in late 2010, early 2011.
Somebody can sit there.
And late 2011, early 2012, and it came out this September. I pretty much knew that Bashar al-Assad would still be in power by the time of the publication of the book, and I had that in mind when I published it. So why did I name it that? I mean, for me, the House of Assad has fallen. In a personal way, because he did not fulfill the tremendous promise that many people had, including myself. So at a personal level, he has fallen, in my eyes. And at a more professional, systemic level, the whole raison d'etre for the Assads, both father and son, for ruling Syria was to provide stability, especially after many decades of instability prior to 1970 when the father came to power, and it's quite valued in Syria. Obviously, that is no longer the case. Bashar al-Assad, in my view, has lost his mandate to rule, and in fact, and legitimacy to rule, by the fact that the very policies he's been following since the uprising began has instilled instability and disruption that which is against and contrary to the purpose and mandate of the Assads over the decades. Now, Bashar, as Warren noted, he is almost universally reviled today as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a prototypical Middle East tyrant. He unleashed his forces on his own population, and at the end of the day reminded many Syrians that he was much more like his father than many had hoped he would be when he came to power in 2000. And much of the disappointment in Bashar al-Assad, particularly in the West, is based on what I call the conceptual gap between the Syrian leadership and much of the rest of the world, how the Syrian leadership sees the rest of the world. I remember when the first meeting I had with Bashar al-Assad in May 2004, and after the pleasantries and so forth, and I explained what I was doing, I said, Mr. President, one of the biggest mistakes you made upon becoming president in 2000 was that you let it be known that you liked Phil Collins' music, the British rocker. And he gave me this strange look, and I could see behind those eyes, him thinking to himself that this is the guy we gave access to. He's asking me these stupid questions, and I explained that. I said, no, it's the reason is that it fed into this emerging profile when he did become president, that he would be this pro-West modernizing reformer because he spent all of 18 months in London getting an advanced degree in ophthalmology. Because he loved computers, because he loved the music of the West, because he loved other technological toys of the West. And so when the expectations are that great, the disappointment and the fall is that much more observable. And we have to realize, and what I was saying at the time and everywhere I've been since that time, is that you have to lower the expectations. One, because the Syrian system is pretty inert and you can't change it overnight. But secondly, look at Bashar. I mean, he is a child of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He is a child of the superpower Cold War. He's a child of the tumult in Lebanon. And most of all, he's a child of Hafiz al-Assad. These are the influences on his life and his worldview, much more so than spending 18 months in London and liking Phil Collins' music or the Electric Light Orchestra or other Western rockers. Now, when Assad spoke on March 30th, 2011, was his first speech addressing the uprising that had gained pace in Syria in mid to late March. And he, of course, branded terrorists, conspirators, armed gangs as the primary culprits for the unrest. And he still does. This has been the almost daily refrain of the Syrian government. Most of those outside of Syria scoffed at such blatant misdirection from what many people saw and what are the real socioeconomic and political problems that brought the Arab Spring to Syria. But many Syrians, even Assad himself, they readily believe this stuff. Any of you that have spent some time in Syria, it's a country that is and even the leadership at the highest levels, even amongst those that have been educated in the West or in Europe, in Russia, or so forth, it's tremendously paranoid about the outside world, tremendously paranoid. And their perception of the nature of threat is vastly different from what we see outside of Syria. Blame it on this Syrian paranoia bred by imperialist conspiracies of the past, Arab-Israeli conflict, and/or regime brainwashing to consecrate the necessity for the security state. But it is in large measure a function of living in a dangerous neighborhood where real threats are indeed often just around the corner. It is this conceptual gap or perceptual gap that is at the root of the impasse, particularly in the beginning of the uprising, between what much of the international community demands of the Syrian regime and what Assad and his supporters are actually doing or feels they should do to end the violence against the protesters and enact far-reaching reform. I'm also sure that if I met Assad at any time during the uprising, even to this day, that he would point out to me that he has made extensive concessions and enacted dramatic reform. He would complain that he is not receiving any recognition or credit from this, and as such, he would conclude, as he has done in the past, as he has done in the past with me on other cases, in other instances, that the United States and the West have it out for him, and that no matter what he does, it will not be enough. And I think he would sincerely believe this. This is one of the reasons he does not trust the West, he does not trust the UN, he does not trust the Arab League. Now, Assad is the product of an authoritarian system, one that is a paradigm of stagnation and control. The Syrian system is not geared to respond to people's demands, it's geared to control people's and shape people's demands. It is not geared to implement dramatic reform. It is constructed to maintain the status quo and survive. Real reforms are counterintuitive to the basic instincts of an authoritarian neo-patriarchal system. Now, I got to know, as Warren said, Bashar al-Assad, I think, fairly well. And he was different. I think most people, almost everyone I know that met him, particularly those that met him versus Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, who, of course, he is now in that category, and the category you don't want to be in these days. And they readily agreed that he was different. He didn't, reek of this eccentricity or even what some say evil, that lurks beneath the surface. And this is why many people thought that he could be a reformer, because he was relatively normal. He had an atypical background to the path of Middle East authoritarian ruler, at least that which is perceived in the West. Thus, that many people who thought that he was this relatively normal person were shocked that he would sanction this brutal crackdown of the uprising. And maybe this perhaps says something more about human nature, about human behavior, and even how normal people can succumb to power. I remember in the first book, the New Lion of Damascus, and I compared Bashar, and others were doing this as well. I think I was the first, but to Michael Corleone in The Godfather, and how in The Godfather 1, and how he promised, certainly toward the end, that he would clean up the family business, that he would make it legitimate. And many people thought that this is what Bashar was doing, and I'm fairly convinced that he actually intended to do this or try to do this in the beginning. And I think he thought he was doing this. Again, from his perception in his world, he thought he was doing this. Others, however, he was falling far short of reforming the Syrian system, which is maybe unreformable. Of course, many people were saying, no, you should compare him to Fredo, not Michael. That's giving Bashar too much credit. Fredo, of course, the weakling, indecisive older brother. It turns out that actually Bashar was more like Michael, perhaps, than Fredo in the long term. And I guess now many people would say that he's no longer, Michael Corleone at the end of Godfather 1 with at least the hope of legitimizing the family business, but he's Michael Corleone at the end of Godfather 2 when Michael is sitting there on the bench and realizes that he has become his father, and perhaps even worse in some cases. Assad, in my view, he lost his way. And I saw this incrementally, and perhaps we can get into some of the things that I saw that convinced me that he was losing this way. The arrogance of authoritarianism, in my view, will do this. Either he convinced himself or was convinced by the sycophants that his well-being was synonymous with the well-being of the country, and that what he was doing in terms of violently putting down this uprising and not meeting the demands for change were both necessary and correct. And in a way, I saw him become much more comfortable with power. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in an authoritarian system, when you become more comfortable with power, you become more comfortable with being an authoritarian leader. You assimilate into that system. And you realize, as I think Bashar did, that you can only prosper in that system if you become a part of it, instead of changing it and realizing perhaps he could not change it as dramatically as he first wanted. My friend Roger Owen from Harvard University, eminent Middle East historian, wrote a book recently that some of you may have read on presidents and authoritarian leaders in recent Middle East history, and he also touched on Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. And he talked about in that book about how these sycophants around the leader tend to help the leader create this alternate reality, to construct or orchestrate this alternate reality. And so if you hear this stuff, and I was around the cabinet ministers and the Ba'ath Party leaders frequently, and going out to dinner with them and all sorts of things. And the way they talked about Bashar, he was a prophet. He was a savior sent to bring the country out from its past and into the future and into the national community, make it strong again, all of these types of things. And I think if you hear this often enough, you begin to believe it. And again, that's just human nature. And there are others who knew him as well, who saw this progression over the years. And there was particularly one point, which I won't get into now, but maybe in the Q&A someone can remember to ask me, but in the 2007, his quote-unquote re-election or referendum, it really came home to me that he had drunk the Kool-Aid of power and that he was going to be president for life. He also developed, in my mind, a strong feeling of triumphalism, particularly after 2005. And I saw this up close and personal. And triumphalism, I mean, he survived what they thought was the worst that the Bush administration could throw at him following their opposition to the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq, following the accusations that Syria was at least turning a blind eye, if not helping jihadists across Syria into Iraq, which they were doing, by the way, and Syrian officials told me they were doing it. However, they also said usually after that, we were hoping you guys would just kill them. And this way they would never come back. Some of them are coming back now, knowing the terrain and the landscape and having established networks in Syria in the current situation. So he survived that. He survived the fallout from the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafi Hariri in February 2005. And of course, the UN led an investigation, and the Bush administration, Syrian exile groups really came on after Bashar, and people were counting the days. But he survived that and actually prospered and was reintegrated into the international community. So this developed this sense, this really palpable sense that I saw of this triumphalism and this ability to survive. And I believe that this has played a crucial part in his response to the uprising. He believes what he is doing is not only surviving but saving the country. This is another significant challenge, and he will survive it just as he has in the past, although this one is much different in many different ways from the challenges in 2003 and 2005. The thing is about the Syrian regime and Bashar and the leadership around him is they look at this in the long term. You know, if it takes 10 years to get back to where they were or to win, then so be it. You know, this is not a 1 or 2 or 3 year thing in their mind. If it takes a long time, so be it. And the Middle East affords everybody an opportunity to reintegrate themselves into the regional fold. It's just the way the Middle East has been. It's happened to Syria. And Bashar has seen it up close. Bashar saw it with his father, because it happened to his father on a couple of occasions. Now, in another sense, the Syrian government's crackdown is a push-button convulsive response to domestic threat. It's business as usual. It's not as though Assad does not control the security forces. It is that this has been the way Syria works under the Assads, both father and son. They reach into their historical pocket and they find what has worked in the past, and it's much closer to what Warren described in 1982 at Hama, in the destruction of the infrastructure of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, than anything else. And to date, Bashar has not been willing to reduce the tremendous amount of leeway that he's been giving to the security forces to deal with threats in his country. And I saw this up close and personal. The Mukhabarat, the security forces, came after me on several occasions, and I'm quote unquote was a friend of Syria. I hate to think what they do to their enemies. And one occasion in particular, in 2007, later in 2007, in November, I arrived at the airport. I had a scheduled meeting with President Bashar the next day. And on occasion, most occasions, I'd have someone, a couple of cars waiting for me from the Office of Protocol at the airport in the tarmac, and I'd just get right in. On a couple of occasions, however, that I had to go through customs, and that's fine because sometimes he had other dignitaries visiting, and the Office of Protocol was busy, and so this time I didn't see anything on the tarmac. I said that's fine. I went through customs, and my passport was confiscated, and they said I was on the blacklist. And that's not a list you want to be on in Syria. And of course, security, one of the branches of the Mukhabarat, is in charge of the airport, and they came over and took me to a room with no windows, and several of them were sitting around me. I was in a very low chair, and they were in high chairs. And the colonel, who was asking me questions, was twirling a gun in front of me, and which I hope wasn't loaded. And it was all intimidation. And again, if you go to the Middle East often enough and long enough, you have guns pointed at you at some point. It's really not as threatening as it sounds, but it happens. It just happens. And so I wasn't terribly intimidated, but it wasn't fun either. And it was about 3 hours, and they didn't believe I was there. I was there seeing the president. And the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing in this case. And here I've been visiting the president on a fairly regular basis for 4 years at that point. And finally I convinced him that he would be in more trouble if he didn't call the office of the president and check to see if I was actually visiting with him than if he just went on and he did whatever they wanted to do, probably just kick me out of the country or something like that. And so he called, and he found out that, in fact, I was meeting the president. And it was all worth seeing his face and his mouth open and then he became my best friend after that. He offered me tea, and he said, they told me you wrote a book on him. Can I have your autograph? And he had nothing to write on, and so he gave me the sheet that had the blacklisted names on it, including my own. And so I signed that, and he let me go and gave me an escort out of the airport and all of that. And I saw the president the next morning. And, of course, as he usually does, how was your trip? And I said, other than the 3-hour interrogation, it was fine. And, of course, he was like, what? He was shocked. He said, that'll never, please, he told his assistant, please make a note, that'll never happen again. Well, it happened to me in February. A few months later, the same thing. I was still on the blacklist. I'm probably still on the blacklist. It's a black hole, actually, from which it's almost impossible to escape. But the same guys were there in security, and so we had a nice laugh. And and they let me through. But at the end of that meeting, I came back to this issue, and I said, Mr. President, I'm going back, in a couple of days, and I'm giving testimony in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Senator Kerry at the time, on ways to improve U.S.-Syrian, or whether we should improve U.S.-Syrian relations. And I was on the side that was advocating more dialogue and seeing what, if anything fruitful could emerge from that. And I said, Mr. President, I'm giving, a testimony from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and this just happened. What if I was roughed up a little bit? What if I was imprisoned, which could easily happen? I would go back there, and I could say, just nuke Damascus. Forget about the dialogue. I could be really upset about this. And I tried, in a very dramatic way, to tell him that you've got to get control of it. In fact, I asked him, I said, if you do not get control of these forces, they will come back and haunt you. And his response was then, as it had been in the past, that it was a necessary evil. The mukhabarat, the security forces, who are involved in almost every aspect of life in Syria. And almost everyone in Syria has gone through what I went through, or much worse, or knows someone who has. And he says it's a dangerous neighborhood, and it is a dangerous neighborhood in that we need this type of thing, but he's not willing to rein them in, because that's just the way things work in Syria. So he simply went along with, and of course, how did the uprising in Syria, what lit the fire? It was the hubris of the mukhabarat in the southern town of Daraa against those 15 teenage children who wrote graffiti on the wall. That happens all the time. But in the new circumstances of the Arab Spring, it lit the fire, much as Mohammed Bouazizi did in Tunisia. So Bashar simply went along with business as usual, instead of understanding, again, these new circumstances of the Arab Spring. In addition, the regimes of Bashar and Hafez al-Assad simply do not make concessions without cracking down. They do not do it from a position of weakness. They will only make concessions from a position of strength. So cracking down hard on the demonstrators while offering political forms are two sides of the same coin. This is the Syrian way under the Assad. So Hafez al-Assad did his job very well. He constructed an airtight but stultifying array of family, tribal, sectarian-based patronage system that produced loyalty and stability. Bashar's initial strategic vision for an internationally respected and integrated Syria became consumed by a Syrian paradigm of political survival. He was either unwilling or powerless to stop what in Syria is a reflexive response to perceived threat. He retrenched into a typically Syrian authoritarian mode of survival, an Alawite fortress to protect the sect's hold on power. Many of us hoped Assad would change the system. What seems to have happened, in my view, is that the system changed him. And from the beginning, Bashar and his loyalists always saw and pursued a security solution to the uprising. How am I doing on time?
Oh, don't worry about it. It's fine.
Okay. Always saw a security solution to the uprising. I can guarantee you that Bashar was absolutely shocked when the uprising seeped into Syria in March 2011. To the point, I mean, in late January, he gave an interview to Jay Solomon of the Wall Street Journal, where he basically indicated that Syria was immune from the stuff that was happening in Tunisia and beginning to percolate in Egypt. The mouthpieces of the regime in various Syrian publications in February were actually extolling the virtues of the protesters in Egypt and Tunisia. They were in support of them, so sure that Assad was safe and secure and beyond condemnation. And what they were saying was that, and they totally misread the situation. What they were saying was that Bashar al-Assad had been against the American project in the Middle East. He was against Israel, supporter of Hezbollah, Hamas, the resistance forces in the Middle East. And this sort of thing certainly generated street credibility in the Arab world. And therefore, Mubarak and Ben Ali, lackeys of the West, lackeys of the United States and Israel, that's why they were falling. That's why the protests were occurring in those countries. Also that these were septuagenarian and octogenarian leaders, whereas Bashar was a relatively young 45 at the time. He was in touch with the Arab youth. He had been popular on the street with much of the Arab youth. So he really thought he was immune. In fact, unfortunately I learned after the book was published, but that Bashar actually commissioned 3 reports from his national security apparatus to investigate whether or not the Arab Spring would seep into Syria, and all 3 said no, it would not. And so this is why I'm fairly certain he was shocked by the when the uprising really hit, and maybe is, and I think that shaped, informed his response as well in terms of blaming external forces, because he was popular, and there was a genuine level of popularity, or at least not revulsion against him, maybe against the system that he mortgaged away, of course, subsequently. And so, you know, he thinking this, it could only be outside forces, pernicious forces from the outside, and trying to mate with unwitting forces internally in Syria to overthrow the regime. I think they really believed this, because he really believed that he was popular beyond condemnation. Now, unfortunately, one way or another, whether the regime does or does not fall, this situation likely means continuing bloodshed and potential regional instability. It's not a pretty picture. It has become an existential conflict. It has been for some time. It's become so militarized on both sides that any peace initiative of any import stands very little chance of succeeding. And I see, you know, basically, and we can maybe explore this in the Q&A a little bit more, but 3 scenarios. I mean, one, and something I've written about recently, is what I call the Lebanonization of Syria. Now, they're very different in some ways, but in the sense that Syria might break down into fiefdoms controlled by various factions of the opposition, while the government weakened controls certain areas in Syria, where outside powers then connect with or ally with various factions and groups against others. It becomes a situation not unlike, in that sense, Lebanon in the 1980s and early 1990s. One side could win. And that would probably only happen right now if the equation is changed on one side or the other. Military intervention, or heightened military aid and support for the opposition. Certainly military intervention I don't see happening anytime soon. Or the government somehow getting the wherewithal to deliver a knockout punch. But I don't see any side, as the forces stand right now, being able to deliver a knockout punch. So this could just likely go on and on and on toward that Lebanonization scenario. And then, of course, the third scenario is a negotiated settlement. And again, unlikely in the current circumstances. Lakhdar Brahimi, who I have a great deal of respect for, and his task is pretty insurmountable at the current time. But he has made contacts. He's trying to learn the landscape so that perhaps when a moment comes for a negotiated solution, which a esteemed diplomat in the room today also mentioned, might have to include Bashar al-Assad for a while. I think it's, as distasteful as that may be, it may have to be with Bashar al-Assad lasting for a little while, at least till 2014, when the next presidential referendum is due. Of course, along with more constitutional reform, political reform, guarantees in terms of real change occurring and real elections in 2014, et cetera, et cetera. However, this is a non-starter with many of the opposition right now, most if not all of the opposition. So again, it's not a very pretty picture. I'll end with a quote from my first book, The New Line on Bashar al-Assad, on Syria, The New Line of Damascus. And in it I wrote the following at the end, toward the end. I said, Bashar cannot become a modern reincarnation of his father. If he does, he would indeed become the new line of Damascus, but this is exactly what Syria does not need. Will the shell of the dictatorship molded by his father, the repressive and controlling institutions of the state, transform Bashar into a reluctant dictator, or will Bashar, the president of Syria, eliminate the institutional basis of Syrian dictatorship? I think I have my answer. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. I want to ask you a couple of questions. I'm in mind that one of my favorite questioners, Jeffrey Laurenti, has to leave at 7:15, so I may interrupt myself to go to him. But let me just ask you a couple of things first. Jeffrey, don't leave without to give me the high sign. I want to ask you about the event of this week, which is the creation of this new national coalition at the big meeting in Doha. I think it must be awfully suspect to people because it basically was organized by the Americans. And I think that means it's not going to get very far. But I've even written down here, and I won't recite them, the names of all the people they chose. I know you know Syrian society very well. What is your estimate of that group and its potential to represent, well, it's potential two things. One, to bring a settlement, but more importantly, maybe to provide a target or a source, target's the wrong word, to provide a group of people to whom, people from the West who want to contribute even up to arms and weapons. Does this coalition represent something trustworthy for them?
I am very cynical about this new Syrian coalition, and I hope I'm wrong. The SNC, the Syrian National Council, of course, proved to be quite the failure. They have an important presence in the Syrian coalition, maybe more so than what many people would want, particularly since the Syrian National Council has become essentially a bastion for the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. And there's some question as to, there's 65 seats in this assembly or so forth that they have formed. The Syrian National Council has been accorded 22 or 23, according to different sources I read, and there are about 10 more people, several of whom I know, who were members of the Syrian National Council and have not renounced they kind of resigned, but not really resigned from the Syrian National Council. And so I have lots of questions regarding the nature of the Syrian National Council. Most of all, I agree with you absolutely totally that the fact that the U.S. and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and outside countries, in other words, were forming this immediately creates a great deal of suspicion in Syria. And I can't believe, the whole idea behind this, and which I agree with in the intent, certainly from the U.S. perspective and the comments from Hillary Clinton, was to have more representation of those inside Syria. And they arranged for some to come out, and there's more than what has been in the past. But I really don't see that important of a representation. And this is where the real power, in my view, this is where the real power is in this uprising, in the opposition, is those fighting and dying in Syria itself, the military councils, groups you've never heard of and people you've never heard of, that will have a say in what goes on if and when Assad regime falls. And I can't, and they've already come out with a great deal of skepticism about this organization. Again, it's in the beginning moments. Perhaps we should give it a chance and an opportunity. There was a lot of spin, as you might expect, surrounding this. There was a lot of spin surrounding the head of this Syrian coalition. And even the name, the Syrian Coalition of the Revolutionary and Opposition Forces.
I was going to say in asking the question, I always thought the UN was best at coming up with really infelicitous names. But that one, it is the new National Coalition of Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces.
So a revolutionary and opposition forces, are they the same? Are they different? Two different groups? It's interesting. But that's, again, I don't know what you can read into a name. But the new leader of this that was chosen is an imam from the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and I don't know him, Sheikh Ahmed Muaz al-Khatib, or al-Khatib. I haven't seen the name in Arabic, so I don't know if it's Khatib. Mm-hmm. Is it Khatib?
I don't know. It's Khatib in English.
Khatib, okay. And therefore, again, I don't know him personally, but I've seen the spin from one side, and I've seen the spin from the other side that goes to his website and finds some really. There was a piece in Foreign Policy, came out this week, that raised some questions about how moderate an Islamist is he. And it was meant in many ways to counter the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood position, as well as to appeal to the opposition, which is almost totally Sunni Arab Muslim. Anybody of any import in the opposition is really Sunni Arab Muslim. So I have a lot of questions about it. There are so many fault lines in the Syrian opposition from the very beginning. And the biggest one, and the one that's hampering this one, the one I alluded to earlier, is the fault line between the external opposition and the internal opposition. This has traditionally been the case in any sort of revolutionary opposition movement, between those in exile, who have been in exile for many, many years, and those who have lived under the regime and suffered under the regime and fighting and dying, as I said earlier. And you saw these differences come up in Iraq. I think that's a major fault line that has not been bridged with this coalition. I mean, I applaud the efforts in terms of from the U.S. point of view in focusing on the opposition and focusing on making it more inclusive and having a strategic vision for the future. And they've been woefully, pathetically lacking behind in that sense. The opposition has, in my view, since the beginning of the uprising. But I don't want to condemn them too much because insurgencies by their very nature tend to be decentralized and maybe have to be in order to succeed. So will something coalesce that is representative of the many different ethnicities and religious sects in classes in Syria is a big question. And will they be able to formulate a vision for a post-Assad future that is more inclusive, that gets most of the people in Syria who are sitting on the fence, and most of the people are sitting on the fence. I do these calculations in my head, and I'm a historian, not a mathematician, but about 22 million people in Syria. If you you look at the opposition, that are fighting, actually, maybe a couple of 100,000, that's probably generous, very generous. And then the support behind them, let's say you have 1 million. Let's say you have hardcore supporters of Assad, including the Shabiha, the paramilitary groups, the core elements of the Syrian military. Let's say 1 million. Let's make it 1.5 million. Again, very generous, probably. So that's 2.5 million. Let's say 3 million, just for the heck of it. What are the other 19 million doing? Now there are a lot of children, of course, and so you can cut that in half, probably. And 60% of the population in Syria is below the age of 25, which is the basic problem in Syria and all the other Arab countries that have experienced the Arab Spring, the youth bulge. But the vast majority of the population are just sitting there and trying to survive and trying to stay out of the way of the fight and trying to decide where to go. And what they see is that the regime right now, even if they don't like it, and many of them don't like it, offers the best alternative, or is the least worst alternative, compared to an opposition that's divided, that's not inclusive. Certainly some of the minorities that have been courted by the Assads, the Christians, and of course their own Alawite sect, are fearful of a Sunni Arab regime that would wipe them out if they came to power, certainly if it was an Islamist-tinged regime or outright Islamist regime. And these types of things have happened all too often in the modern history of the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, which had a violent political culture. So there's a lot of questions that I have.
I want to ask you something about the military, but I know we're about to lose Jeffrey, who, by the way, is described in the book as an astute observer of UN diplomacy. Jeffrey, you're on.
Thank you, Warren. David, 2 years ago, if one were looking at Syria, one would have seen not just the Mukhabarat and the army as the pillars of the regime. One would have seen the Ba'ath Party, presumably, and its network all the way down to towns, neighborhoods, villages. One would have seen the public administration. One would have seen Christians, the business community, and all that. As the regime has gone into its extreme and dire straits, is anything left of the support bases in Syrian society for it but the Mukhabarat and the military? Is there any part of Syrian society that could screw up the courage to say to the president, we need to cut a deal and trust in the foreigners and Brahimi and whatever to cut something that saves us? Is there anybody outside Syria to which the regime still listens seriously and has some leverage over it? Or is this an entirely closed regime system that is hell-bent on the apocalypse?
Yeah. Internally, and that just reinforces my comment that you were astute. It's a very astute question. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Internally, no. I don't think there's anybody that can convince the regime. Again, there are many of these groups, Sunni business class, that have been the Assads have done a great job of co-opting many different sectors of Syrian society. I mean, you add up the Alawites, the Christian population, Druze even, Sunni business class that they've co-opted into the system and maintenance of the system. Bashar particularly has courted Sufi orders in Syria. You're getting up there in terms of maybe 50, even more than some Syrians would say, more than 50% of the country that, again, maybe not agree with everything the regime does or support the regime, but see it as the least worst alternative. Now, having said that, particularly during this national security crisis, the inner circle, which was fairly close and closed to begin with and opaque, has gotten even tighter. And as I said, it's a national security solution, so the mukhabarat and certain elements of the military have risen in terms of their importance, much as the Pentagon rises in importance when we're involved in war in this country. But I don't see anybody internally having the ability to go up to Bashar or his brother, Maher al-Assad, and say, you've got to cut a deal. I don't think they've reached that point. They still think they can win. And what's even more scary, in my view, I think they feel they haven't really taken the gloves off yet. I think they feel they have been fairly restrained. That's their conceptual paradigm, that they have been fairly restrained in this domestic unrest. They could do a lot. They could do a lot more in terms of the indiscriminate use of their military, at least in their view. So in that mindset, no one's going to be considering cutting a deal right now because they think they can still win. Outside, the only ones I think that may have any influence with Bashar are the Iranians, not Russia. And that's why I think one of the reasons, for many, many reasons, Russia has been supporting the regime. There are practical reasons, financial, economic, military, strategic, all sorts of things. But I don't think Putin, who's been opposed to Medvedev's policy with regard to Syria in the beginning, Medvedev, especially when they switched positions, Medvedev was a bit more he abstained on the Libyan Security Council resolution and so forth. Putin's, from what I understand from my Russian scholar friends, were not, Putin was not for that. And I don't think, I really believe that one of the reasons Putin hasn't given the okay for any support in the UN Security Council resolution is, yes, all these other reasons that he does not want, to give the green light for what could possibly be military intervention or anything else in Syria and what that might mean for the region. But I think he has built himself and placed himself rather intentionally in this position of importance. And many people in the West see Russia and Putin as the key in this, if we can turn them. I think what he knows, and certainly Russian Middle East experts know, who know Syria well, that if he all of a sudden gave the green light and abstained or even supported a UN Security Council resolution, a tougher one that opened the door for further actions against Syria, that Bashar al-Assad wouldn't go. He'd just thumb his nose at Putin. And so Putin would seem powerless. He'd lose his position of leverage and importance that he has built up. But the Iranians, in my view, the Iranians are the only ones that if they went to Bashar, along with Hezbollah and so forth, and said, we really think you should go. We have a nice place for you in Tehran. That may not work, but they're the only ones I think that could convince him, and that will only happen if Iran is certain that its interests are secure in Syria, even following the fall of Bashar.
David, we'll take two questions. Abdullah Al-Saidi first, and then Ann Phillips after that.
Thank you, Dr. Lesch, for an interesting presentation. I have two questions, and I have to contest two of your themes.
Okay.
You started by saying that Bashar lost his mandate because he cannot provide security. I say...
In my personal view.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's what I am contesting.
Okay.
I think he lost his mandate because he used lethal weapons and heavy weapons against his people. That's why he lost his legitimacy and his mandate. This is one. Two, he's not a typical Middle Eastern tyrant. He's an exceptional Middle Eastern tyrant. And you are right. He is in the category of Gaddafi and Saddam. The other tyrants in the Middle East folded and left, including in Yemen, in Tunis, and here the generalization is not warranted. My question is, what's the role of both Bashar mother, who incidentally always reminds Bashar of what that famous woman in Grenada, when the ruler surrendered Grenada to Isabella and Fernandez. And then he cried, and his mother said to him, "You cry like a weakling for a state. You could not fight for it like a man." That's what Bashar's mother tells him every day. You are not like your father. And secondly, Maher, what role does Maher play? And what's the status of his health? And you know, another presupposition, not presupposition, but another idea I heard in the UN and everywhere, that Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, used to rule Syria through mukhabarat.
He what? I'm sorry. Could you repeat?
Rule Syria
yes.
through mukhabarat. Bashar, when he comes, mukhabarat rules Syria through Bashar. So Bashar is a weakling. My question is, what role does his mother, does his brother, Maher, and whether the elite is split in Syria, particularly those military elite from his sect?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Since that was two questions in one, just do that and we'll go to Anne afterwards.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador, for your comments. And I would not disagree with your first characterization of Bashar losing legitimacy because he used force. In fact, it's kind of like the flip side of my own view that he's not providing the stability that the Assads had done, through force and through the security state. And he hasn't provided it because of his own policies, as I said. And those own policies are what you pointed out and elaborated, were the use of force in his own population. And to me, it's the most troubling or saddest part of this whole drama in the beginning, at least with my view of Bashar, is that he mortgaged away and again, I don't want to say popularity in the country. I mean, but a level of acceptance and amongst a good part of the population, not all, certainly. There's some that have been wanting to get rid of him from the very beginning and never saw him as much different from his father. When he could have perhaps leveraged that, especially earlier on, could have leveraged that popularity to implement real change in the country, which is what many people were doing. I remember a number of meetings I had with Bashar, and there would be cabinet ministers and Ba'ath Party leaders who would come to me and say, "Could you bring this up with Bashar?" Because they were afraid to, because they would lose their jobs. I just might lose my access or something like that. And some of those things that I did bring up to him as time went on. And so you could see some of the disappointment even among the political elite that he didn't live up to the enlightened inauguration speech he gave in 2000. As far as the mother and the brother, I haven't met either one. I know the mother is an influence, and more importantly, the Makhlouf family, and Mohammed Makhlouf and Rami and others are tremendously influential in many, many ways. They are certainly part of the inner circle. As far as Maher al-Assad, and again, as this became a security solution, Maher's importance rose. I have heard rumors, and from some people I really respect and trust, that perhaps Bashar might have countenanced a negotiated solution or something along those lines, or even left the country, but Maher would just put a bullet in his head. So I think that tells you about their relationship. They are dependent on one another in many ways. I don't see a tremendous split right now, but that could happen, especially if Bashar takes another direction. So in some cases, he's a captive to the system that he allowed to ferment and germinate under his rule.
Now we'll take two questions. Ann Phillips and then colleague John Hirsch.
Yes, good evening. I'm afraid I don't have much of a voice, so I hope you can understand me. This was fascinating. I thank you very much for this. I just have a quick observation and then a question. I am struck by the parallels, the similarities between two tyrant sons. Hafez, I can't even speak, no, Assad's son, and Gaddafi's son, Saif. Saif, I had met a few years ago. I was invited when he came to New York to a small lunch given for him. And it was small. I was quite surprised. There were about 10 of us at lunch around a table. And I had the opportunity to sit rather close to him, and I could chat with him. And we asked him questions. And I ended up liking the fellow. I left there liking him. And he was the one that the Libyans, or at least many, I can't say all the Libyans, felt was the hope of the future. He was the one who was speaking about democratizing Libya and so forth. And he had this big foundation that he organized to give funds to charities in the West and so forth. When push came to shove, blood came first. Blood, the cliche, blood was thicker than whatever water. And he came out for his father and said, there'll be blood in the streets. And he gave up his life. Now, whether that was weakness because of his father's influence or strength, I don't know. But it would be interesting to know psychologically the relationship between father and son, rather than mother and son there, whether that was whether it was blood that drew him to that, rather than not only power. That's just an observation. My question is, do you think that ultimately, because of the uprisings of the Shia in Bahrain, discontent of Shia in Saudi Arabia, in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, and throughout the whole Shia crescent now, that this could end up in an area or of conflict between Sunni and Shia as a result of what's going on in Syria?
Okay, just hold that thought. And John Hirsch.
First of all, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
It's terrific. Foreign Minister Lavrov recently said that President Assad will never leave Syria, and the only way out for him is to be dead. And I wonder what you think of the thought I've had for a long time that a lot of these dictators never figure out what's going on until it's too late. So if you think about Ceausescu, Mobutu, Siad Barre, Gaddafi, Mubarak, they all went to the end of the line thinking somehow they could make it, and of course they didn't. So I wonder if you think that's kind of the dynamic here, that he's going to be killed at the end of it all because he can never change his mindset to accept that he cannot succeed.
Thank you.
Good question.
Just answer those two questions. Thank
Sure. What's interesting, Ann, about Saif Gaddafi is that a representative of him actually visited with me some years ago and wanted me to perhaps write a biography of him because they saw the biography of Bashar al-Assad. And although I had a lot of criticisms of Bashar, and and so forth. It was a hopeful type of thing. And I said no, because I don't, I know something about Libya, but I'm not a Libyan specialist. But I thought that was interesting. And so he even saw the parallel that existed at that time. As far as the Sunni-Shiite dispute and the kind of, the King Abdullah of Jordan kind of hatched or launched this Shiite crescent, from Iran through Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and so forth. As a historian, I tend not to buy into those things. The problem, though, is if enough people believe in them, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if the Saudis and the Qataris and others who fear this Shiite crescent, which is simply a code word for Iranian influence in the heartland of the Middle East, then it can become such a conflict. And unfortunately, what we see in Syria is it has become a function of a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and their respective allies. And Turkey is involved in there as well, which has tremendously complicated the whole situation. And then you have these concentric circles of, you have a real civil war that's occurring, and then you have a circle of regional powers that have diverging interests in Syria, and then you have international powers, another concentric circle. And so trying to resolve the situation in a way that satisfies all three of those circles, those levels, is practically impossible. So the more we think of it in these terms, the more we think of it as a Saudi versus Iranian or U.S., Israel versus Iran or something through that, then I don't...
No, I'm thinking there's a regional conflict between the Shia and
Yeah, I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening. As far as, John, your question, and I'm asked this, quite a bit, is why didn't, Mubarak and Gaddafi and now Bashar just, Ben Ali and these guys, why, why didn't they just take their, millions or billions that they have stored away in banks and just go live a life of luxury and just get out? And I think it has to do with what I said earlier and what Roger Owen has written in his books about this alternate reality that's constructed or orchestrated around them. They don't see the world as others see it. They don't see the house coming down, and they believe in their own destiny and righteousness. And I saw this happen with Bashar, and this reminds me to the point where it is too late by the time they see it. And they may never see it until the actual bullet goes in their head. And with Bashar, it was driven home personally to me when I saw him in 2007, right during his re-election, or what was a referendum. It's a referendum, yes/no vote. He was the only one running. And I met with him, and there was also, and the personality cult had returned to Syria and to Damascus. His father, intentionally or unintentionally, whatever, a personality cult was constructed or certainly grew around his father. Bashar eschewed that when he came in. I mean, he had a lot of the pictures in the government office taken down and all this sort of, he wanted to be thought of as kind of a regular guy. I mean, he and his wife would go out without bodyguards. He would drive his own car, which did occur on occasion. But after a while, every Syrian is convinced they saw them in their local restaurant, and it becomes urban legend. But it did happen. So that was this image they wanted to construct. And I saw this image change. And in 2007, during this referendum, the pomp and circumstance returned. I was milling around the parades and that were going on, and all the pictures that were practically the size of buildings almost were of Bashar, and I love Bashar pins and yes to Bashar, as if there was a real election occurring. And he won 97% of the vote, not the 99% his father usually got. And I met with him, and I said, basically, so what do you think of all this? And I half expected him, and perhaps, in my eyes, seeing this Bashar that I had come to know, saying, oh, it's just a bunch of, and I realize what's going on and all this sort of thing. But he really ingested it. I could see it. He basically, in the book, I describe it as, some of you maybe remember this, in the book I describe it as his Sally Field moment. Sally Field, an American actress, won her second Oscar for Places of the Heart, I think it was 1984, and she went up to the podium to accept it, and she said, "They love me. You really love me," to the Hollywood audience. And that's exactly, I mean, I remember thinking it at the time, and he was saying that, they love me. And I was like, you really believe this? I mean, this type of thing is orchestrated. I mean, you know, some of it's genuine, but you know, when Rami Makhlouf and Syria Tel put up a stage and they have the Syrian singers and all the other corporations don't want to be seen not doing that, they do this, and the government ministries and all the people, you know, they come out because they don't want to be seen not coming out, whether they love Bashar or not. And so there's all this stuff's going on, and he absorbed it. And I remember thinking at that time, I mentioned earlier, drinking the Kool-Aid of power, and he really did. I saw that change in him at that moment, which perhaps had been, you know, an evolutionary process over the previous years. And I remember thinking to myself, specifically when I heard him talking about this, I said, "You're president for life now," and I just had a lot of concerns about where he was going to be taking Syria after that point.
I want to go to the segment. I just want to ask one thing in addition to that. Does the alternative universe theory also explain the willingness of the Syrian military to go off each day and bomb their own people? These pilots may think that these are outside terrorists, but they're dropping these bombs on the center of Aleppo and Homs. And what keeps them? We've had some defections, but earlier hopes that you would have an implosion of the Syrian military have not happened, and it appears that they are willing to continue on with this onslaught against their own people. Are they also in an alternative universe where they don't realize what they're doing?
I think it's a combination of survival, particularly the Alawite and other minority elements of the regime and certainly of the military, because as I said during my talk, I mean, they're fearful of what will happen, that they will get wiped out. It's either you kill or be killed in this instance. And also it is, I think, a part of, they've bought into this paradigm of external forces and jihadist forces that are constantly, they're being bombarded with in regime propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda. I mean, you talk to Alawites, and there are a number of journalists who've been embedded with some of the Shabiha Alawites. Nir Rosen, in particular, has written about them quite vividly. Peter Harling has written about them from the International Crisis Group, and they believe in the propaganda that they will all be wiped out. There's all sorts of stories from the regime through Syrian TV and other media sources of Alawites being cut open alive. And one story I heard from a friend of mine that he really believed, and again, hopefully these aren't true, but maybe they are. I don't know. But that an Alawite went through a meat grinder alive. And this is the sort of information that's being fed to and absorbed by a number of these people. So they are in many ways fighting for their survival.
William Verdon.
It's on? Yes. William, you opened by saying that from your point of view, he has fallen. Mm-hmm. In his mind's eye, which is probably a bad pun based on his former career, but does he have a sense?
I wish I thought of that for my book. No.
Does he have a sense that he has fallen? I mean, is there any way that he can check the reality of his situation? And if he's assassinated from within the regime, how destabilizing can that be for Iran and that government? Thanks.
First of all, in his mind's eye, again, I have not seen him since 2009. So this is just based on my own reading of the Syrian leadership and of Bashar al-Assad. But in his mind, no, he has not fallen at all. He's protecting the country. He's surviving. He's saving. And more than that, as I said, he's saving the country. And I really do believe that he and particularly others think that. I mean, it's a combination of survival and maybe it's a rationalization of these things that these atrocities that are happening. But I really do believe that he thinks that. And so I don't see that changing. which is part of the reason why I think he will stay, probably past the time he should stay in terms of his own survival. And the second part was, he's assassinated. Yeah, if he's assassinated from within, in my view, as I was conversing with Ambassador Abdullah Saidi, I would think it's because he's lost his nerve, or is seen to be losing his nerve. Maybe an inkling that he might take, a way out, and that's when some of the tough guys, the Maher al-Assads and some others, would move against him, perhaps. And that's a scenario I don't see happening anytime soon, but it could happen. And I don't know what Bashar is thinking in these terms. But if that happens, you'll see this continue on. I mean, I don't see the core group letting up at all, because again, they still think they can win. And the point is when a point is reached when they think they might lose, and then they may say, okay, we'll come to the negotiating table. Well, that's probably well past the point that the opposition will agree to come to the negotiating table because they have the advantage and they have the leverage. Of course not now, maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, but not now. So, and this gets back to John's point about waiting until it's too late.
That's, it's not a happy note to end on, but I think there are that many happy notes. About the only happy note I've heard, actually I'm trying to bring it to a close. Let me just tell you, there are books for sale outside. David is going to stay here, signed books. And could I ask you just to come forward and ask him the question yourself? I don't want to go past 7:45. The only happy note I've heard tonight, and let me leave it with you this way, that if any of you have the idea you're going to go out and utter the names of Sally Field and Bashar al-Assad in the same sentence, credit David Lesch and say you heard it at the International Peace Institute. Thank you for coming, and David, thank you very much for...
Thank you all.